whatever reason in the early 2000s, it feels like absolutely everyone who ever had the opportunity to make a new game, movie, or TV show came to the same conclusion that because we survived the technological apocalypse that was Y2K, we all deserve to enjoy some fun in the sun. And by fun in the sun, I mean we deserve to bask in the glory of not losing all of our technology and simply pretend that we're enjoying a nice beach vacation. And so for like 4 or 5 years, we were drowning in media where the developers suddenly all realized that, water's pretty cool and tropical environments are fun, so let's make something with that. And in turn, we got everything from movies like Finding Nemo, Lilo and Stitch, Pirates of the Caribbean, and Atlantis, to games like Final Fantasy X, Sonic Adventure, Super Mario Sunshine, and The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker. If you wanted to make something based around the ocean, then this was your moment. But I guess my question would have to be, why? Why were games, even starting in the late 90s to the early 2000s, so obsessed with having water be one of the primary focal points for both the environment and the mechanics of these games? Were they just really excited that they could animate water well, so now they just threw a crazy amount of it into everything? Is it because very few games up to this point were able to create 3D landscapes that were able to accurately convey these more tropical environments to the degree that developers wanted them to? Or was it all just a massive coincidence and there's no real reason for there to be so many incredible games in this time frame that were defined by having, as IGN would put it, too much water? Well, it's probably pretty apparent at this point that that's exactly what we're going to try and get to the bottom of today. So dive in with me as we discover what really brought about gaming's soggiest generation. So I think we really should begin with easily the wettest game of the era, and that is The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker. Now, I could happily talk for hours about the game's reception, how the cartoony cel-shaded graphics were divisive on release, and how this game has become a fan favorite over time, but I'm sure you've already heard all about it a million times, and so that's not really why we're here. We have more important business to attend to, and that's figuring out the rationale behind The Legend of Zelda's development team looking at the formula that they had nearly perfected on the N64 and saying, okay, but what if we just took the Hyrule everyone knows and love, and instead of doing that, we drown it. But we don't just drown it, we drown it with such a biblical intensity that even the fish people in the game need to grow wings because somehow it's even too much water for them. So to truly discover the why behind having Link sail around a drowned Hyrule, I turned to the source, which is Eiji Aonuma, the game's director, where he describes it like this. Without much hesitation, we decided rather early on to set the game among the seas. We liked how we could use the open sea in designing the mechanics of the game world, and more than anything, we thought it would be interesting to show the sea in that visual style. I think we got into a good flow with everything, coming up with ideas about what the islands in those seas should be like, and what the people living there would be like. While exploring the Great Sea in The Wind Waker, you are able to start charting the world in its 49 islands pretty much as soon as you're able to acquire the sail for the King of Red Lions. And while you may not be able to make the most of what a lot of these islands have to offer until you get specific items or progress to a certain point in the story, the fact of the matter is that they're there for you to find straight from the get-go. While they still wouldn't have the capabilities to create a world that felt as massive and fully realized with graphics more akin to the 2000 Space World demo they had created showing Ganondorf and Link fighting, the focus on traveling by water really allowed them to create this deceptively massive world while making use of the title's unique art style and remaining within the technical restraints of the GameCube. If you're familiar with the Legend of Zelda franchise, you'll know that Nintendo has always kind of played with the idea and pushed the envelope regarding what actually makes a Zelda game a Zelda game. In every facet, it was their goal for it to not feel like any of its predecessors, while maintaining the DNA of what made people fall in love with the franchise to begin with. And while, let's be honest, we know that Link romping around Hyrule on Epona's back never really gets old. I can totally see why they may have wanted to switch things up as they headed into this new era of gaming. But to really set this game apart, they wanted to do something that no one else had done to any meaningful extent yet, which was to have the player be able to control the wind, which Miyamoto mentions in a press conference that for a long time we've wanted to be able to use wind in games. We've had windy stages in the Super Mario games before, but it really wasn't until we were able to use the technology of the Nintendo GameCube and some of the visual styles possible with it that we were able to really show wind blowing in a video game. So that was one of the things we decided to challenge ourselves with, which made it a driving force behind the Wind Waker. And so when we really think about it, it was this pairing between these wind-based game mechanics that would allow Link to get from place to place on the back of his sentient sailboat, and the fact that they wanted to make this game distinct from the rest of the franchise by setting it on this cel-shaded and flooded world that made Nintendo decide to have such a soggy entry in the Legend of Zelda franchise. And let me tell you, this game had an absolute stranglehold over my imagination as a child when it came out, with it literally being the reason I saved up money to buy a GameCube. I would save up my allowances, do extra chores, and even take cotton balls, glue wings on the back of them, and color them blue with markers to create miniature Navi fairies for me to attempt to sell to my parents' friends for $0.25 apiece. While this would be the endeavor that ultimately killed my entrepreneurial spirit, as I only sold one, I think this showed my dedication to the cause. However, when I did finally save up enough to get my GameCube, I walked into GameStop, wad of cash in hand, ready to finally take on the Great Sea with Link. I was given better news than I could have ever hoped for. GameStop was running a promotion that allowed you to get any 2 games off of a list they provided, and while I had gone in with a plan, I made the game day decision to bundle in Final Fantasy, the Crystal Chronicles, and Pokemon Colosseum with the GameCube instead of the Wind Waker because, well, I thought the covers looked cooler. And if you're wondering why I'm going on this tangent, it's all a thinly veiled ruse so that I can talk about my favorite part of the Crystal Chronicles game, and that's the ridiculously satisfying cutscene that plays at the end of each area where you get to fill your crystal chalice with a bit more myrrh, which, in my childlike mind, was the most entrancing and beautiful thing I had ever seen in a video game. I kid you not, I quite literally played the game almost exclusively for that cutscene and the satisfaction of filling up my chalice just a bit more. I was a simple child. But to get back on topic, if there is any Final Fantasy game that actually applies to the topic at hand, other than filling up a chalice with liquid, it would have to be none other than the first mainline Final Fantasy game to release after the merger between Squaresoft and Enix to create the Square Enix that we know and give an ungodly sum of money to today, Final Fantasy X. Now, when I think of Final Fantasy X, my mind immediately goes to 3 things: Besaid Island, Blitzball, and Tidus' Sword Brotherhood. And do you know what all 3 of these things have in common? You've got it.
Ice, cold, water.
Final Fantasy X was interesting because it was meant to be a distinct departure from the appearance of the franchise up to this point. In an interview with V-Jump magazine in 2001, Final Fantasy X's art director Yusuke Naora said when asked about these aesthetics of the world, let's see. After the cyberpunk and near-future settings of 7 and 8, we returned to our roots in Final Fantasy IX. So the question became, what should we do next? And to be honest, that question vexed us. Around that time, I happened to be looking through some books and travel pamphlets and randomly thought to myself, you know, Asia's really nice too. There haven't been many Final Fantasy games in that kind of setting. There have been games set in China or with a Chinese atmosphere, but nothing with a Southeast Asian or similar setting. So I thought I'd try drawing some pictures to flesh out the vision I had, when lo and behold, I read Nojima's script, and by chance it turned out to have the same feeling. So, for all intents and purposes, this much more tropical and eastern design of the world of Spira, as we're introduced to it, was chosen because the developers wanted to select a setting that just hadn't been really explored before in a Final Fantasy title yet. And so, this combined with the fact that Kazushige Nojima had revealed that he was inspired by a trip to Okinawa, which in turn also became a major real-world inspiration for Spira, illustrated to us that this game was destined to be a tropical one, as it seems as though, without even really discussing it, everyone was already on the same page regarding what the setting would be straight from the get-go. It's interesting because it's not too different from the reasoning that the Legend of Zelda Wind Waker's developers gave as to why their game was to be set on the Great Ocean. This was an opportunity to take the franchise in a direction that it had never been taken before. And in turn, the developers over at Square Enix made this more tropical environment an invaluable tool to bolster the game's narrative, and in turn, the game's main threat, Sin. If you're not familiar with Final Fantasy X, Sin is more or less a giant whale that kills everything it comes in contact with. Think Monstro from Pinocchio, but more demonic and Final Fantasy-ified, and instead of eating people and letting them live rent-free in his belly like Monstro, he just kinda kills them. Yoshinori Kitase described it as being a force of nature for the world of Spira, which is very akin to earthquakes and typhoons. From the very beginning, the game doesn't tiptoe around the devastation that Sin can cause and why it's so important for Tidus, Yuna, and the rest of the party to stop it. Final Fantasy X focuses a lot on the relationship between civilization, nature, and technology. And throughout this, while there are several antagonists in the game who pose a major threat to the party, none come close to reaching the levels of Sin. But I think probably the funniest thing that stood out to me when researching this video, and why so many games were themed around water at this time, was that initially Tidus was supposed to be an underwater plumber, with the man, the myth, the legend, Tetsuya Nomura, admitting that he had drawn some concept art with Tidus in a more plumber-esque attire, and admitting that the overalls that Tidus wears are the only real piece of the design that translated over when the game's producer, Yoshinori Kitase, had suggested making Tidus more of an athlete instead of a plumber. But to keep with this underwater theming of his character, they had the entire sport of blitzball take place in a massive sphere of water, which, while I know it works, and we're talking about a fictitious world here, I feel like blitzball would be a terrible spectator sport. I mean, it's essentially hyper-aggressive underwater version of handball, which is cool, but unless you are exclusively watching it on the screens, I feel as though it would be nearly impossible to see what was actually happening with that much water disturbance and air being created in the arena. But I suppose if there can be a giant demon whale that destroys the world, I can buy into extreme underwater handball. But it looks like for Final Fantasy X, to answer our question, the water is so prevalent not only just to, serve the narrative and take the franchise somewhere it never really had the chance to go before, but also to give the game some visual flair and personality. Pair this with the fact that the PlayStation 2 was powerful enough to show gorgeous pre-rendered cutscenes, and it's a no-brainer why they choose to use so much water in the world of Spira, with many of these pre-rendered cutscenes being able to show off how brilliantly they were able to animate this water. And when thinking about Tidus' occupation, maybe there was a little bit more behind the decision to change him from a plumber to an athlete, aside from just making him a little bit cooler. Because when we think about it, there was another plumber at the time who had an island-based adventure set to release in the very near future, which is my attempt at a smooth transition into talking about Super Mario Sunshine.
I am Flood, glad to meet you. Hey, someone's coming.
I don't quite know what I was expecting to learn when I had initially looked into what the inspiration for Super Mario Sunshine was, but I can honestly say that I wasn't expecting the game's director, Yoshiaki Koizumi, associating the feeling of the GameCube controller's triggers with the feeling of playing with water pistols to be the thing that would inevitably lead to the team adding the flash liquidizer ultra dowsing device that we all know and tolerate today. But here we are, and goodness, is Flood a mechanic that certainly happened. Now, I'll be honest, I've never loved or hated Flood. It's just kind of been there for me when I would play Super Mario Sunshine throughout the course of my life. I was much more focused on getting far enough into the game for me to be able to ride on the back of Yoshi whenever I got the opportunity to. And so, while Flood is certainly not the most fun platforming tool for me to rock with. I think that ultimately the ends justify the means because this game just screams summer to me. Like, if you were to look up summer in the dictionary, the very first thing that you would see is Mario with his weird t-shirt on while still wearing gloves, knee-deep and absolutely coated in disgusting goop, fighting off a phantom manta ray on the foundation of a beautiful seaside resort. I don't know what dictionary we're going off of, but I'm sure that would be the first image in some dictionary. The point being, everything about this game just makes you want to stay inside on a beautiful summer day, pretending like you're soaking in the sun at the beach as you run around Isle Delfino, which brings me to the fact that while this game may have Mario's name on it, I think that the true star of this game is Isle Delfino itself. If you somehow aren't familiar with Super Mario Sunshine at this point, the premise behind the story is that Mario and Peach are going on a much needed vacation to the luxurious Isle Delfino. However, when they get there, they see the island is being plagued by someone posing as Mario and playing the very first recorded game of Splatoon all over the island. And so Mario, who's blamed for the mess, is deemed responsible for having to clean up this gross, goopy sludge. And good lord, what a pleasure it is to do so. And so while Super Mario 64's levels were built around the mechanics that the team wanted to put on display, Sunshine's levels were specifically built to fit into the area and the aesthetic of Isle Delfino. And so when we think about why Super Mario Sunshine is so wet, all things really come back to this idea of Mario running around cleaning the island with a water pistol, with Koizumi stating in a press conference held in Japan around the game's initial launch, the water pistol gameplay reminded me of summer. And then when I came to think about a tropical island, isn't it great to play with water on a hot island? Which was then followed up by Shigeru Miyamoto saying that the Nintendo GameCube can reproduce water beautifully. We thought it'd be a shame not to show the beauty of it, so we wanted to use water in many different ways. From the beginning of the project, we wanted to sell the new Mario game during the first summer after the Nintendo GameCube's debut, so featuring water sounded like a great idea. Which, you know, that answers our question pretty handily. Add in the fact that the codename for the GameCube was literally Dolphin, and you have a match made in heaven to put a water-centric Mario title on the GameCube. And thus, the first game where Mario actually does something even remotely comparable to plumbing was born, as a way for Nintendo fans to have fun in the sun with their favorite superstar. Though, before Mario had even booked a reservation, Sega's Blue Blur had, believe it or not, already beaten him to the punch. I've always had a weird affection for Sonic Adventure on the Dreamcast, and for a game that came out in 1998, I feel like it can't be understated how shockingly good this game looks. Now, because this game came out a whole 2 years before Y2K, perhaps it was meant to be a one last hurrah for the Blue Blur before the world descended into anarchy and we watched the electrical grids fail and all have to rely on our one doomsday prepper uncle that we all thought was crazy, but he was really the only one who had actually prepared for the apocalypse, so we had to swallow our pride and move in with him anyways. But then as we would live out the rest of our days in complete and utter despair, at least we would be able to look back on simpler times where at least we could have those fond memories of getting to run around as Big the Cat desperately searching for Froggy. Now in reality, this game initially stood out to me for one reason and one reason only when I was a kid, and that was chaos. When I played the original Sonic Adventure for the first time, it was admittedly a copy of the director's cut on the GameCube that I had rented from a local Blockbuster. And while I had played a number of 3D games up to this point, for whatever reason, Chaos absolutely blew my tiny elementary school mind. Seeing this living creature made entirely out of water that actually looked pretty decent in a game was crazy to me. Plus, I thought the brain floating in its weird watery dome was truly weird. Fascinating. Also, I think that I'm not alone in saying that being chased by a massive whale as we are running across a ramshackle pier right outside of a resort made me think that this game was on the next level. This game right here, it's transcending. It's cinematic. This is what gaming would become. And in retrospect, I can definitely look at this game with a bit more objectivity. But again, it's not why we're here. We're here to determine why was Sonic Adventure so wet? And I think I found my answer in this interesting interview that Retro Gamer had with Takashi Iizuka and Kazuyashi Hoshino about the development of Sonic Adventure, where Hoshino explicitly explains why water was so prominent in the game, to the point that Chaos is, for all intents and purposes, just a giant water spirit. He said that he was most excited to display semi-transparencies in the game wherever they wanted, and explained that one of the key benchmarks for quality in video game graphics is the representation of water. No matter what hardware generation you're developing a game on, we have been working on techniques for representing water and are always looking at how other companies and other teams are representing water in the games they make. We thought Chaos, who is a strong yet fluid and beautiful representation of water, would be a perfect symbol for a game on this new hardware. And thus the Water Spirit Chaos was born, and boy oh boy, if you see the true ending of the game, which many of us I'm sure have, then you will see that he lives up to both the monikers Chaos and Water Spirit, as he moves almost as a force of nature to drown an entire city at the end of the game, in a manner not dissimilar to Sin from Final Fantasy X, and he must be stopped. And as you can expect, the only thing capable of stopping an enraged elemental force of nature is a zoomy Hedgehog cosplaying as a Super Saiyan. It's beautiful. Just beautiful. I think it's fair to say that before the Dreamcast, PlayStation 2, and GameCube, it just wasn't possible or practical for a game to take place primarily at sea like the Wind Waker, or have a sentient raindrop be the primary antagonist of the game like in Sonic Adventure without it feeling a bit half-baked. Now don't get me wrong, Wave Racer 64 is an incredibly fun game that looked pretty good, all things considered, on the N64. But if we look at things like the Great Bay and Majora's Mask, this is an area that worked well for the hardware it was on. And while I definitely have a lot of nostalgia for this portion of the game, looking back at it, I also think that the Great Bay proves that a Wind Waker-esque game would not have been viable prior to the GameCube. I think that developers were finally free to more or less make the games they wanted to make, both visually and mechanically, in this generation. If Mario wants a portable water pump to help him platform, then he can have a portable water pump and he can look damn good doing it. If Final Fantasy wants to create an entire sport that takes place within a giant orb of water where all of the athletes are miraculously able to breathe, then why not? It'll look great, even if actually playing the sport in the game is a punishment that I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. When it comes down to it, this was an age of exploration, and so each of these franchises took to the seas in their own unique ways. Gaming was made the better for it, because while each of these games have their pros and cons, looking back on them, the fact of the matter is that this incredibly soggy era of games is different from anything that we had ever seen before, and each of these games that we've talked about made a tremendous impact on the trajectory of their respective series. And while this isn't exactly an exhaustive list, as we could also point towards the Hoenn region in Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire, or the Destiny Islands in Kingdom Hearts, the core idea of why I believe that having more tropical settings with vast oceans and water-based enemies was such a staple in the late 90s and early 2000s was primarily because, well, they could make water actually look really good now. Each and every one of these development teams wanted to show their tricks off in new and interesting ways, so they did. They finally had the technology available to them, so they made the most of it to give us these incredible and beautiful adventures. They took us places that these franchises have never gone before, and some of them have never gone to again. And so whether it is making the primary threat of the game a giant water spirit, having a plumber use a super-powered camel backpack to clean up the graffiti of Bowser's child, who inexplicably believes that Princess Peach is his mother, following a JRPG boy whose claim to fame is that he's really good at water handball, or setting sail on the high seas with a young man who took the phrase "dress for the job you want, not for the job you have" way too seriously. Each and every one of these games came to the same conclusion, and I think it's one we can all learn from. When you are given the resources to revolutionize an industry and show the world what you're made of, all you need to do is just add water.